Hello and welcome to the Trust and Influence in B2B podcast. I'm your host, Joel Harrison. In today's episode, we're exploring one of the most significant and least understood shifts that's happening in B2B marketing right now, and that's the rise of Agentic AI and what it means for trust. You've probably heard the term Agentic AI all around B2B and elsewhere in the kind of the last few months, even last year. But I suspect that many marketers might be kind of quietly unwilling to admit they're not entirely sure what it actually means in practice. Let alone what it means ultimately, potentially, for their relationship with buyers. So that's what we're going to dig into today, because while Agentic promises some enormous productivity gains and new ways of working, it also introduces potentially some unexpected consequences, and trust is near the top of that list. So my guest today is Andy Johnson, who's founder and director of client strategy at Hut3. Hut3 are one of the most respected, award-winning ABM agencies operating in B2B right now. And he and the team at Hut3 have been among the earliest adopters and deployers, I should probably say, of Agentic AI across the B2B space. They've really pioneered it for me, and I've been really impressed by how kind of progressively they've grasped the opportunity here. And as I say, they've not just been watching this technology, they've been out there building it. So we're going to talk about in this episode what Agentic AI actually is in plain language, and why it represents a genuine step change, not just another AI update or another AI product. How the relationship between buyers and brands has been quite transformed when AI agents start acting on people's behalf. Why trust becomes fundamentally different kind of challenge in the agentic world, and who is accountable when things go wrong. We hope they don't, but they might. And what B2B marketers can actually do to navigate this space in confidence. That's the critical thing. What do we do about it? So Andy, welcome. Great to see you. Thanks for coming on board.
Yeah, hi Joel. Well, appreciate you inviting me. So I'm genuinely looking forward to having a good conversation about Agentic AI. Something we've talked about a lot in the past, but good to get it down.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's great. Thanks for your time on this one. Remember, if you've enjoyed listening to this, or you're watching this even, because this is obviously video as well, if you liked what you heard, don't forget to subscribe or to like. There's loads more great content like this one. But in the meantime, Andy, let's start by kind of getting into the whole of this topic here. So Agentic AI is a term which is quite omnipresent right now, but many people may not be actually clear on what it actually means. I think they know what it means, but perhaps let's kind of level set by, could you explain it to someone who's intelligent but not technical? That definitely, I'd like to think I'm intelligent but not technical. I think you'd be the judge of that. But how would you define it in those contexts?
So I suppose probably the easiest place for me to start is if we think about just ChatGPT for 2 minutes, okay? Because we can all relate to that. So you'll put in a few prompts into ChatGPT and you'll get some kind of response back. So that is fundamentally what we would call a call response engagement with sort of an AI agent to a certain extent, okay? Agentic is when we actually start to join multiple tools together in multiple workflows. So we're using specialist tools, if you like, just like you would have specialist people within your team. If you were creating a piece of content, you might have somebody doing the research, you might have somebody doing the actual first draft, you might have somebody doing the editing before you then go to publish that piece of content. So an agentic workflow is where we actually use multiple AI tools to come together in order to achieve one outcome that we're looking to try and achieve. So if I give you a very, very quick example, probably the easiest way I put it is like a conductor in an orchestra. So if we're trying to make a great orchestra, a symphony of noise within one sort of environment, a conductor on his own tapping a stick isn't going to do particularly well. Okay, if that conductor starts to talk to perhaps the woodwind, then suddenly there's some good noises starting to happen. So similar to like a ChatGPT type scenario. But actually, if that conductor can then interact with all of the different sections, brass, percussion, etc., then there's a symphony of noise that's created. So it's probably the easiest way in which I can try and describe what Agentic is, Agentic AI, but it's ultimately about trying to get multiple AI tools all talking to each other in a way in which you're orchestrating that from a human perspective.
And so I guess there's a whole host of tools out there that you could potentially use depending on what you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, some of the workflows that we would be building out could use anything up to about 8 or 9 different AI tools that are available to us. And then what we would be doing is orchestrating those tools to do certain functions in certain orders to make sure that we've got all those guardrails in place, which we'll come on to later on, which do make sure that what we're executing or delivering on is to the right standard, to the right person with the right message, or whatever it is that we're creating. So, and does help us to build a bit of trust, but we'll talk about that a little bit later, no doubt.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. So there's a lot of noise about AI over the last couple of years, language models, generative AI, co-pilots. Where does Agentic fit into that story? Is this a genuine step change or just kind of a rebadging of something we already had, and people selling new stuff to the same people?
Yeah, I mean, Agentic is genuinely a step change. And I think as we start to understand more and more about how agentic can actually aid, particularly in the B2B marketing world. That's the area in which we play, so I know that pretty well. I think you'll start to see that it is fundamentally a game changer in a lot of different ways. But I think if we start to think about, let's just put it into the context of things. So if you think about models, so AI models such as OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Meta, that's where billions and billions of dollars is invested in those fundamental sort of core foundational models. Then what sits on top of those models are tools like a ChatGPT. So, for example, ChatGPT is obviously OpenAI's sort of tool in which we can interact with it. Agentic is basically when we're then pulling together all of those tools. So it's not a new AI tool. It's fundamentally utilizing tools in order to come together to create a solution. However, you could build a new tool by creating an agentic workflow from multiple tools, if that makes sense. So, but agentic does enable us to solve much more complex problems and challenges that a single AI tool would be able to do, particularly in our world, in a B2B space.
Okay, fantastic. It's fascinating stuff. You know, I've talked about this a little bit in the past. It's fascinating to have an opportunity to really explore it in detail. So I know, kudos to you guys. This is not a sponsored episode, but Hut3 have been one of the earliest agencies to really, as far as I can see, to really embrace this agentic AI and actually start to build with agentic AI, not just talk about it. What was the first moment when you thought this is going to change how we work and how we serve our clients? When did it happen for you?
I love when this question came up, I thought, do I be honest? The honest answer to that is it was at a B2B Propolis event. That's when I'd heard a lot about AI, and we knew that it was coming and that there was a lot going to sort of potentially disrupt our particular industry, agency world, agency landscape. But I think when the penny dropped for me was particularly at the Propolis event, where there was one of your panelists was interviewed and they were asked about, what was their ambition with AI, or what were they trying to do with AI? And they said that I think they'd given a single license to every single person in that organization. You're talking thousands of people, with an aim of in a 3-month window to come back with something that would either same time, be more efficient, potentially save money within the organization, to see what everybody could come up with within the organization. So at that point, I think we really absolutely recognized that it was going to be significant. And, luckily at that point, we'd already identified it was going to change a lot of things. And we'd been out and sort of built our team that we brought on board in order to sort of start building our solutions with, as it was then, AI, as it is now, agentic AI.
So at that point, you were in pole position to be able to do something about it. You'd understood, you'd started investing, and you'd be really, the nature of the change was really requiring to you.
I think, Joel, the reality is that I was never an expert at that point. I know my way around B2B. I know my way around account-based marketing. It's fundamentally what we've done for the last 30 years. But, AI was particularly new to us. So hence the reason why we went out and got some very interesting brains from outside of the agency world, because we recognized that this was not going to be fixed from within that agency world, if you like, because we're just bringing the same ideas and solutions to ultimately the same sort of challenges where we needed to think about it very, very differently. So we were really lucky to get that team on board, and they brought with them a whole heap of new stuff that just, started to blow our minds really, really quickly. So we sent them off into a darker room for about 3 months just to come back and say, this is ABM, this is how we deliver. How is artificial intelligence really going to start to play in that today, but also going forward as well? So, and we revisit that roadmap literally every few months because it's changing so fast.
Okay. All right. Fascinating stuff. So it's great to understand we're all learning from this. We're all on a journey to some degree or other. So let's readdress the trust angle then, right? So this is the heart of what we're trying to. Hang on, let me just start that one again. So let's move to the trust angle, which is really the heart of what this conversation is about. In the traditional B2B relationship, trust is built between people over time, through interactions, through consistency. If an AI agent starts handling parts of that relationship, responding to queries, making decisions, initiating contact, hence that trust infrastructure in that context.
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, my personal default, or my go-to is that in an agentic setting, agentic AI can actually be a real trust accelerator, and I'll perhaps come on to that in a second. But I think if we just go back a little step and think about, trust is built in many places within that sort of relationship. So it's built in face-to-face interactions. It's built in the way in which we connect with those individuals through digital interactions as well. So I think it's about understanding where trust is built and how trust is built to see where AI or indeed agentic AI can really sort of start to play a part. And for me, I think, if we dive straight into sort of, if we think about sales environments, for example, trust can be broken with, poor follow-up. It can be broken with slow responses. It can be broken with inconsistent sort of comms. But it can also be broken in a marketing world where it's wrong content delivered to the right person, if that makes sense, and it's the wrong time. So in actual fact, that's where AI and agentic AI workflow can actually start to help build that trust. So I don't think for 1 second it's going to replace that human interaction in the trust building role. I also think it's got quite a challenge in terms of maintaining sort of real human-centric sort of content to a certain extent. Although I do see that getting better, and it will ultimately, I think, start to play there quite significantly. But I think, for me, the way in which I see it is all those gaps where at the moment we might not be particularly good at building trust because there's lots of challenges around, volume, time, etc. Then agentic AI can really come and sort of help play a part in that particular place.
Okay, so there's potentially kind of interesting asymmetry here. The buyer not always necessarily know they're interacting with an agent, or they might not know how much autonomy the agent have. Does that transparency matter in B2B? And if so, why does it matter?
I think I would probably just default back to asking the question, if we're delivering email marketing, for example, through HubSpot, does the actual end user worry about the fact that it's coming from an automated system or not? I think we can transfer that straight into sort of an agentic or an AI setting in that, ultimately the buyer cares about relevance. It doesn't necessarily care about how it's been distributed to them or in what context it's been distributed to them. If the content is the right content delivered in the right way at the right time, then, I think it doesn't really matter to those individuals whether it's coming from an AI. And I don't think they would probably have the time to sit and consider, is this coming from a specific AI agentic workflow? I think if it's really poorly delivered, then it matters. And I think because it gives the opportunity for the end user to ask that question in the first instance, who's writing this? How am I receiving this? And so in the same way as which I think if we think about where this potentially plays out over the coming years, and we'll get onto it in a second, the volume of content that will start to be delivered and the pace in which it will be delivered, in the same way as which from that email marketing perspective, it goes into spam filters or it drops into, not relevant filters that we can delete quite easily, the same will happen with content that's delivered poorly from an agentic AI perspective as well.
So relevance, context, all of these things pertain to trust. It's not about necessarily whether it's being sent in that moment or as part of that chain by a bot or by a human.
Yeah, and I think, again, it makes the conversation a difficult one when we talk about bots or by humans, but it's still fundamentally delivered by a human, but it's delivered by a human in a way in which an agentic workflow is activating the delivery of that to be as timely and relevant as possible. So as long as we get all of that correct, then the end user, like I say, I don't think would probably worry about whether that's being delivered by AI agents or whatever you want to call them. I would call them workflows.
Let's call them workflows. Let's be nice. Let's be kind.
Right.
So I think that's a very good point, right? But it's an interesting conversation. I think it's something we're all going to have to wrap our heads around.
I think one point, John, I would just add to that is that ultimately the accountability is still with the human. It's still with whoever's orchestrating that particular workflow, that particular process, that particular response. It still gives us the opportunity to remain human in that response.
I agree. Just the nature of where the human sits in that conversation perhaps is shifting and is realigning. But the human has to be at the value end of rather than the commoditized end of the spectrum. Great. This is really fascinating already, Andy. So let's just dig in a bit further and talk about the risks and the challenges. Because people might be thinking, potentially things can go wrong with all of this. What we talked about there, you've nicely addressed that one. But are there significant areas or risks that agentic AI introduces to the B2B context, whether the organization is deploying it for the buyers? So Andy, let's talk a bit more about the risks and the challenges associated with it, because there are inevitably going to be some perceived ones or actual ones. Let's decide on that one. So what are the most significant trust risks that agentic AI introduces into a B2B context, whether for the organization deploying it or for the buyers on the receiving end?
So I think I would probably come at that from an angle of,
I guess it's the same as so much around using technology or even any form of system, rubbish in, rubbish out. You know, if what you're putting in at the top of the hopper is rubbish, then you're going to get crap out the bottom.
yeah, and I think, and also just absolutely fragmented systems will be one of the worst culprits of that rubbish in, rubbish out, you know, because I think if they're broken in any way, shape or form, then there's no way in which they can actually get the right information in order for it to digest and know what it's supposed to be doing with that. I think the other thing as well, Joel, that's really worth picking up is just, you know, a lack of governance. We are seeing a significant lack of governance across the board when using AI tools. I mean, just as simple as if you've got employees using ChatGPT and it's got training left turned on. There's huge gaps in lots of different ways that AI is potentially creating some significant challenges for organizations. And I think the pace of it and the desire to really utilize AI to its full capacity has meant that lots of organizations are probably a little bit more liberal than they should have been, but are now probably getting some kind of control back over some of that as well.
It's interesting. Every time I talk to people about AI, it feels like we're oscillating between we're angering ourselves that we're being too liberal and angering ourselves that being too conservative. And it doesn't seem to be a happy middle ground anywhere. But I know we're all going to admit that we're going to get it wrong almost in the same moment.
But if you think about historically, you know, we would have developed web environments. Well, we'd always put a web development into a staging environment or a sandbox or whatever you want to call that. And then the actual reality would be in a different environment. But we don't seem to have any of that sort of real governance, I suppose, to a certain extent. Or we're seeing a lot of organizations don't have a lot of those types of governance. And I think there's some real howlers potentially will come to the surface at some point, I have no doubt.
Or already they've already happened, probably we just not hearing about them. I mean, on an issue that's related to governance, is accountability. And so when an AI agent makes a mistake potentially or handles a situation in a way that a human would handle very differently, who's responsible and how does the trust recovery or how should the trust recovery work when there's no person to apologize?
So it's a really good question. I want to answer it in lots of different ways, but ultimately, again, I would go back to the simple fact that the accountability always sits with the human and the governance, because the agentic workflow will have been built by us knowing the problems that we want to solve. So I think it's about the guardrails that must be in place in order to catch the challenges that it might face. It's about the governance to make sure that it's all correctly governed, of course. And I think if the actual workflows are designed correctly, then if a mistake happens, it should be in a place to catch that mistake a lot quicker than possibly if an agentic workflow wasn't in place. So if some content's gone out the door and it's wrong, by the time it's got to the media, it's probably too late. You know, or a customer's going to be hopping mad about something because they've received the wrong information at the wrong time. You know, a workflow has the ability to put some of those guardrails in place and actually probably deliver more timely to the organization when an apology needs to be made. And I still think that the room is needed for humans to make those apologies if that's what the apology needs to be. You know, if a human needs.
And we need to surface the fact that it needs to be made as well in the first place, don't we?
Absolutely. And then an agentic workflow can absolutely pull that to the fore. So, you know, if we know that it's an issue that's been created that's a minor issue, it can be dealt with via stream A. Where if it's an issue that's really can't be dealt with via stream A, it needs somebody to actually pick up the phone and have that conversation. He can actually then signpost that a lot quicker than possibly by the time it's gone through customer services, for example.
All right, so we dwell quite a lot on the negatives for this, you know, because that seems to be, there's a lot of caution and wringing your hands about that. But it's not all negative, right? Because if it wasn't all negative, we wouldn't be doing it. We wouldn't be investing in it. It wouldn't be such a big deal. So let's talk about some of the positives and the opportunities. Are there ways in which agentic AI can actually strengthen trust in B2B rather than threaten it in the way you've described?
Absolutely. I think, you know, we're seeing some really good solutions that have delivered some incredible results, you know, working with large enterprises and small businesses. But, you know, I think when you're talking about organizations that might have an ambition to create personalized content, I think that ambition's long been there, right? Particularly in the account-based marketing world. We know that we want to get the right content into the right hands and we want it to be as personalized as possible. You know, agentic workflows can really help to do that at some significant pace. You know, we've got a current case study going through the business at the moment where they want to deliver 11 one-to-few programs in 11 weeks. Use case programs in 11 weeks would never have been possible, but they are through agentic workflows. So it is absolutely really helping to sort of, change, I suppose, the capability. So suddenly we can turn a lot of marketeers' ambitions into action because the capability is now there, whereas once it probably wasn't. I think there's another number of other ways in which it is ultimately helping. More timely, more personalised, correct responses, correct signposting of issues. So some of the things that we've probably covered.
So trust is the output from doing good marketing, right? If you and basically Agentic AI is enabling you to do better marketing faster, then trust is the output. Trust is the negative if you don't put all those building blocks in place properly or do all the work to get your agent set up properly.
Absolutely.
And it fails. So in that respect, it's kind of binary.
Absolutely. And I think goes all the way back to some of the earlier questions. What is an agentic workflow? Well, the agentic workflow is orchestrated by us. So, it's incumbent on us to make sure that those workflows are doing all the right things to make sure all of those guardrails are in place. We know the outcome of what we want to achieve. That's probably the easier bit. The bit that's slightly more difficult and more challenging is making sure that we get that right outcome without doing any wrong outcomes, if that makes sense.
Okay, it does make sense. I think my next question we've kind of answered, but I'm going to ask it anyway. When you look at the organizations or use cases where agentic AI has been deployed well, and you've got a number of clients with whom you're working with, and distinguish it between the ones where trust is being eroded, I guess that's your point about, are the people who got trust problems as a consequence of agentic AI being open about it? I suspect they're probably not. But what do you think? What does good look like? What's the difference between the two of them? I guess I would suggest from what you said, it's about setting it up properly in the first place, doing the due diligence, thinking it through properly, getting it structured right. Am I correct? Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much. I think there's a few, key areas for us is about connected systems, not silos. So I think, again, if you're creating content to be delivered to a number of organizations that might sit within a program, if you can't connect to the system to get the right data of the organizations that you want to deliver to, then that's going to be a challenge, right, within that workflow. So it's about connected systems. I think it's also about having a clear AI versus human role. Again, I'll go back to it. If we're looking to create a piece of content, we will go through 5 or 6 steps in that process, which is our historical sort of process for doing that. Well, what we're trying to do is orchestrate agents, if you like, or AI within workflows in order to sort of still service some of those roles. And if anything, what we've seen is the need for the expertise in those areas is even more required now. So again, you might say, well, is AI reducing the number of individuals that we work in? No, completely the opposite. We've increased the number. We've increased into new roles and new job titles, and it's all really quite interesting. But anyway, coming back to that, strong sort of data foundations, and I think also continuous learning loops. So making sure that we're constantly learning, and we really are. We've learned at a rate of knots over the last 12 months, and I think not just us about how we build those agentic workflows, but also the AI capability itself is suddenly making some of those workflows so much more better than what they were even a few months ago.
Okay, fantastic. And I liked your point. The thing you always aside there, and you're talking about actually the number of people that you're working with, working on this is growing. I mean, that's directly contrary to the number one fear which people was constantly getting waved around in the news media, in marketing meetings around it decimating job roles. But you seem to be suggesting that's not necessarily the case.
No, I think there's a definite positive side to it, Joel, if I'm completely honest with you. I think as we go through the process, which we're inevitably going to go through, where AI can just replace what we do, okay, you will probably see the reports that are out there about white-collar workers, for example, and some of those challenges. And I think, you read those and you sort of do tend to get a sense of dread and concern and all those sorts of things. But I think what we're not necessarily doing is thinking about, rather than just replacing a specific function, how can we actually do it better? And how can that then add more value? And I think as soon as we start to go into those sorts of situations and scenarios, we've built out our team in the last 12 months more than we've done in any 12-month period on the back of sort of building out agentic AI workflows. And it's brought new job roles that we never had before. And interestingly, our interview process is very different because we can't just find somebody who's got historical skills doing some of the stuff that we're doing. So it's about problem solving skills. That's what we really need. And the ability. So it's quite an interesting process.
Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. So that does lead me on to the next question very nicely, which is looking at B2B marketers specifically, not the tech team, not the C-suite. What does this rise of agentic AI mean for how they think about their role and how they build their relationships with buyers? I mean, you described how it's changing your organization. What do you think about in the kind of client organizations or prospects that you work with?
Yeah, I think if we just go back to really the very beginning, we talk about that chat GPT, right? That call and response. So I think if you really ease in, we've had lots of stories about, C-level saying, right, just replace with ChatGPT or Claude or whatever it is they want to replace with and start doing some of this stuff more internally in those types of messages, okay? And suddenly what that does is that just shifts teams' time. So in our world, for example, we would speak to a marketing individual and they would be briefing us on wanting to do a value proposition into an organized, into a specific cluster of accounts or something along those lines. So some of that might have been brought in-house because somebody can go into ChatGPT and they can build that value proposition, which is fine. Get that. But now what you've done is you've shifted that marketeer's time from being a marketeer to being a prompt engineer to a certain extent. So if you think about that in that particular sense, then actually we're just going to replace our time in those types of worlds. That's where agentic workflows come in, because it means that actually you can do repeatable tasks a lot more efficiently. You can do joined up tasks. So, sorry, long way of getting to it, Joel. I think if you think right now, activation probably takes up a significant part of a marketeer's time in a lot of roles, activating programs, writing content, generating content, and I think that will inevitably shrink. So I think as agentic workflows come much, much more into that space, I think that will become a much smaller place to play. But the really good news is what we're seeing is that the two bits either side of that, so the strategic side, the orchestration side, is becoming, and I actually would bring those two words together. The orchestration of agentic workflows is incredibly strategic. And I think it's really quite an interesting space. And for me, the other side of that is about measurement, data, intelligence. And we could do another podcast on this another time, but it's about agentic BI now, which is the next thing that we're talking about and exploring. So agentic business intelligence and how that starts to actually orchestrate programs before there's any sort of human interaction with it to a certain extent. So I think, to summarize, the bit in the middle will inevitably shrink. There's no question there to a certain extent, but I'm very optimistic and see huge amounts of growth in either side of that middle part.
But in those parts, the parts you're seeing growing, I mean, not to diminish the middle part you described as the strategic value and moving up the kind of food chain, as it were, in those parts. So that's good for marketers. But it does mean that the nature of the marketing skills and your ability to do those jobs is going to change because you can't give those to junior people, right?
Yes, but it's going to be really important for those who understand what makes good in that middle part. Is going to help to orchestrate and come up with the strategies, etc. That mean in a world where we're just going to have lots of content and lots of people can produce content, how do we stand out? How can we make it more personalized? How is it more relevant? How do we orchestrate it to be in the right hands at the right time? I think there's a lot more work to be done at that front end now than ever before.
Okay. All right. Very interesting. So if a marketing leader came to you today and said, I need to get ready for the agentic future, where do I start? What would you tell them?
Well, I think the easiest word is data. But it's about what data and where's it coming from? How can you collect that data? Where can you interrogate that? Where can you interpret that data? And I suppose, how can you basically centralize it to be able to enrich it, to be able to do something much better than what we're currently doing at the moment? So I think, inevitably data is going to be the one place, but it's such a small word that covers so many different things, right? But yeah, that's where I would say we have to start, whether that's inside intelligence on programs, whether that's about, CRM data sets, whether it's about how we're measuring that. That for me becomes the orchestrator of agentic workflows to a certain extent.
It's fascinating because it all comes back to data in B2B marketing. I mean, as a content person, it's sometimes a bit frustrating, but data was always the kind of opportunity and the biggest problem in B2B, and it still is. Here we are.
Yeah. And I think, again, just that word, because we instantly think when we say data, we think, right, CRM system, organizational data, personal data. That's a very small part of it for me. It's about, what other structured data have we got and unstructured data can we get in order to then inform how we might be talking to clusters of organization, individual organizations. And then what is the data that we're going to get as the output of that? So it might not even go anywhere near your CRM data in terms of worrying about how we start to build agentic workflows to do certain things in a better way. But it's about all of the other different data that we can now gather, centralize, and really interrogate, that becomes the real powerful part of it.
Okay, fantastic. Fascinating, Andy. Absolutely fascinating. So there's so much to go at. As you said, you could do another podcast on this straight away. We have limited time per episode. I guess my final question is where does this all go? In 3 to 5 years, how do you think the relationship to B2B buyers and AI agents will have evolved? And what will trust even look like in that world? Is it possible to have any kind of prediction about that?
I don't know if it's possible to have a prediction. We've 100% got a roadmap. We've got a vision of what we think 2030 is going to look like. Now, no mystic meg, I don't have a crystal ball. But I think if we've got something that we're shooting at, then at least we can be on that path and that journey, if that makes sense. So we might need to deviate from that from time to time, as we often are, and as things are changing at a rate of knots. But I think, we've got a real vision on 2030. I think it might even be quicker than that with some of the stuff that we've now done and we can see taking us there a bit quicker. But I think there'll be a lot around intelligent engines. So where we can take data to inform campaign activity, to see what then that campaign activity is bringing, to inform data again, which can then actually start to orchestrate it. So a real sort of intelligence engine. And we've been working over the last 3 years on agentic workflows. And I think we can see, an insight. There's a remix area where we're creating content. This isn't a pitch, by the way. I'm getting to a point. Then there's like the ability to personalize content really frequently. And then there's the ability to tell data stories much more intelligently so that everybody within the organization can see what some of the data actually means to them. So the components are there. If we are actually able to join up those, we can really see that sort of intelligence system coming together. And that's going to take different marketers in order to sort of orchestrate that, create the strategies around that, and then to basically harvest that into business outcomes and align them to business outcomes. I personally am generally really excited about the next three to 5 years. I don't think I've ever been so excited in a B2B world as I am at the moment, because I just think for the first time we can really start to see, marketers, I mentioned it earlier, have always had lots of ambition, but often been curtailed by, lack of time, lack of resource, lack of budget. And agentic workflows does really start to help us to see that, they don't any longer need to be the real constraints.
It's fantastic to talk to you and see you have such an exciting, infused, and positive take on what the future is going to look like. And because I think a lot of people are uncertain or actively scared about what's going on. But so it's been fantastic to talk to you today, and I'm sure we're going to return to this topic again. So thanks so much for being my guest today.
You're welcome, Joel. Thanks for having me.
Coming up in the next episode of Trusted Influence in B2B, the fractional CMO is one of the most talked about trends in B2B marketing right now. But is it a smart response to a changing landscape or a sign that something has gone quietly wrong? My guest is Skip Verdura, fractional CMO, non-executive director and board advisor, and someone who's doing this long before it had a name. Skip has a precise definition of what fractional actually means, a clear view on who's misusing the term, and a characteristically honest take on why the model has grown. That goes well beyond the obvious cost story. We get into the structural forces reshaping marketing leadership, what AI is actually doing to CMO's position in the organisation, and why decades of failing to speak the language of the boardroom may have actually brought us to this exact moment. It's one of those conversations that starts the definition and ends somewhere much more uncomfortable. That's next time on Trust and Influence in B2B. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it.